Flax is the world's oldest known fibre, and during the last 2 centuries, the north of Ireland became strongly associated with flax and the linen industry. By the early part of the 20th century, most farmers around the Garva area were involved one way or another, and were justifiably proud of the world-famous Irish linen label. Production was at its peak during the war years, and the Agithy rivers had a large number of water-driven mills, mainly involved in the various stages of linen production. Indeed, there were few people in the farming community who were not involved to some extent in the linen industry. The introduction of man-made fibre plants during the late 1950s began to spell the end of flax growing, and by the early 1960s it had ceased to exist completely in this area. Tom Stewart, whose father was a flax grower, along with his neighbours Hugh Archibald and Sandy Gray, have undertaken to grow 2.5 acres this year. There will be obvious changes from the mid-1950s, but we intend through this film to show the flax season as it was then.
I bought that tractor there 4 or 5 years ago of a chap, John Irwin, and restored her. She's a 1953 Ford's Major with a 4-wheel drive conversion kit fitted on her by Roadless. It's one of the first conversion kits that Roadless ever made, because the axle is actually out of a GMG lorry and was converted to fit the tractor. I would say she must be one of the first 4-wheel drive tractors was about. The plough that I'm ploughing with here today belongs to Hugh Barr, 3 times World Championship with a ransom plough. First won it in Killarney in 1954, in England in 55, and in Sweden in 56. No other man yet has ever done this. He attempted it 3 times and won it 3 times in succession with a ransom plough.
Last year a crop of potatoes was grown in this field, and Tom is now making the ground ready for the flax seed. Ground preparation would have been similar to that for oats or barley. Today is the 20th of April, and Tom intends to have the seed sown within 5 days. Flax would usually take about 12 weeks to grow, so harvesting time should be around the end of July. However, Irish weather once again showed its unpredictability, and for the next 4 weeks it rained almost every day. Taking tractors on the ground would be out of the question. The spring and subsequently the harvest was going to be late. 29 days after the ploughing, on the 19th of May, the weather showed signs of improving, and Tom decided to bring this 1939 Fordson out for the next step in preparing the ground. In the 1950s, not all farmers had a disc like this one, as much of the work was still being done by horses. The disc was heavy to pull, but did an excellent job in cutting up the ground, as the earth had to be made as fine as possible. After a month of almost continuous rain, the ground is still damp, and although the sharp edges of the disc cut it up well, the earth is not yet as fine as Tom would like it, so the men decide to use the brake for further cultivation. The brake is much lighter than the disc and is less of a strain on the Fordson, which is doing well for a 53-year-old. In earlier times, horses could have pulled a brake, and stones may have been placed on top to give a deeper seedbed if required. The ground is now fine and smooth. The brake has also levelled the small drills and ridges made by the disc. Flax needed the ground to be firm as well as fine, and the final preparation was to use a roller. As well as making the ground firm, the roller would also have broken up any small lumps of earth which might have escaped the disc and the brake. The driver this time is Nelson Andrews, another neighbour of Tom's. Nelson for many years did farm contract work, and by watching him operate, it is clear that this is not the first time he has driven a Fordson. Sandy and Hugh are now ready to begin sowing the flax seed. Seeds are small and silky to touch, and it feels almost like putting your hand into a tank of thin oil. This bag of flaxseed had to be imported from Belgium and should produce flax with a blue blossom. Sandy sets the fiddle to number 4. The 100 kilos of seed should sow the 2.5 acres. Sandy sows the field in 2 hours, and on this occasion gives it a very light dressing of special potato manure. The brake will be brought out again to cover up the seeds, and there's just enough light left to roll the ground once more. The weather, which at long last had improved, remained good, and unbelievably the young flax was through the ground in 5 days. It is now the 3rd of June, and the flax has been growing for 2 weeks. Many of the older farmers around Garva are now beginning to show interest. Robbie Andrews hasn't seen flax growing for over 30 years and accompanies Tom to the field to inspect the crop. Robbie seems happy enough with the progress. The whole month of June remained fine and dry, and on the 1st of July this shot was taken. The young plants are now 6 weeks old. The hot sun has baked the ground hard, but Tom need not have worried about drought, for the latter part of July was to bring more than enough rain. As time passed, other country activities were taking place. Back at the flax field, the blossom has now appeared. It is the 2nd of August. And although this blue blanket is a pretty sight, it will still be 2 or 3 weeks before harvesting. Good warm dry weather would now be essential so that the crop would ripen and remain standing. About the middle of the month, Sandy cuts the rushes, which will be left for a while. These will be made into bands for binding the bundles of flax. Sandy Moody gives a demonstration of making a rush band. The harvest weather which Tom had hoped for did not come, as the end of August again brought rain and wind. On the 1st of September, the men decided to start pulling the flax. Unlike oats or barley, flax had to be pulled from the ground rather than cut, as some of the valuable fibre was growing under the surface. The bundles of flax were tied. These were called beats, and 12 beats made a stook. During the 50s, people who pulled the flax were paid by how many stooks they had pulled. The rate of pay was about 2 shillings a stook, 10 pence in today's money. Pulling flax was back-breaking work and most unpleasant during wet weather. However, there was never any shortage of workers, as men and women would have done 3 or 4 hours pulling in the evenings. The extra money always came in useful, as back-to-school time was not far away. The attraction of this unique event just outside the village of Garva was to Tom's advantage, for every evening a good crowd gathered, keen to show their skill at flax pulling. Men like 82-year-old David Gregg, who had travelled the 22 miles from Ballymena. Tom did not discourage anyone and said that he wouldn't mind paying the going rate of 2 shillings a stook for pulling. One big disadvantage was that the long, clear summer evenings had gone and it was now beginning to get dark at 7:30. But his biggest battle by far was still with the weather, and many evenings no flax at all was pulled. More help was to come in the form of this 1940 flax pulling machine, the property of Willie Anderson from Clough Mills. The flax was pushed into a V shape by means of the dividers, and the belts pulled it from the ground. More belts and wheels transported it along the platform where the men lifted it off in beats. 5 or 6 men were needed to operate the puller, 1 driving the tractor, 2 on the machine, 1 lifting off the beats, and usually 2 men coming behind tying. The machine had its own petrol-driven engine, and in good weather conditions with the flax dry and standing upright, could have pulled the equivalent of 8 men. However, conditions here were anything but good, and many stops had to be made when wet flax jammed in the belts. Progress was slow. With half of the field pulled and stooked, Tom decided to fill one of the 2 lint dams. Bertie Stratton had brought along this 1947 TVO Fordson Major for the task of transporting the flax to the dam about 1 mile away. The man forking up the beats is George Porter. The smaller of the 2 dams close to Tom's home will hold about 4 loads of flax.
Right on, boys.
The first load is on its way to the dam, and you can judge that it is quite heavy by the way Bertie's Fordson is steaming. This dam was last in use about 33 years ago, and needed quite a bit of work to restore it to its former glory. The dam had been filled with water from a small stream which ran about 20 yards away. With the weather we'd been having, Tom had no problem finding enough water. The flax is forked into the dam heads down. This process is called retting and would normally take 10 to 14 days in warm weather conditions. However, it is now mid-September and the days and nights are getting colder. Retting causes the outer wood to rot away, as we will see later, and leaves the flax fibre ready for the various other processes through which it has to go. The men worked late that night and got the 4 loads into the dam. The flax had to be totally submerged in the water, and in order to achieve this, weights would have to be put on top. Stones were used for this purpose, and Tom was lucky enough that this old stone ditch was nearby. Stones about as heavy as a man could lift were ideal. Were this not done, the flax would begin to float after a few days, which would mean that it wouldn't ret properly. The men spent about an hour and a half stoning the dam. It was as well that you didn't mind getting wet feet at this job.
That was that kind one. What to see you there? We got the model, I think, for slacks. Yep. The width of that.
Tom's two sons now tramped down the flax, again ensuring total immersion. This dam will have to be tramped morning and evening every day for the next 2 weeks. In days gone by, running over the stones on a lint dam was a favourite pastime for the young people. The risk of getting wet, especially if you were wearing your school shoes, added to the excitement. Tom is glad to have half of his flax crop safely in the dam. However, the other half is still growing in the field. He was now faced with another problem, for the weather had improved again, and the neighbours who had given their time and help so freely were now concerned with saving their own crops. It was beginning to look like the remainder of the flax might not be pulled at all. On Saturday the 19th of September, the Northern Ireland Ministry of Agriculture came to the rescue with this one-man operated flax pulling machine. This modern device not only pulled but also tied the flax beets. The remainder of the flax field was harvested in under 2 hours. That same afternoon it was safely immersed in another dam using more modern methods. After the original flax had been in the dam for 13 days, Tom again consulted Robbie Andrews for his advice. Robbie reckons that it is properly retted, but will give it another day just to be sure. All of the stones holding down the flax would have to be lifted off. Some of the heavier ones were quite difficult to manage. They were wet and slippery, and this time they had to be thrown upwards. Tom now begins the daunting task of throwing the flax out of the dam. This was usually a 2-man operation, one man floating the beets across and the other throwing them onto the bank. Unfortunately, Tom could find no volunteers to go into the dam with him. The smell from a dam of flax at this stage was very strong, something similar to the smell of modern-day silage, and no matter how much you washed and bathed, the odour would still be on your skin for days.
I can remember a fellow from the town here, he'd been working in the lint dam all afternoon, and it was very warm, and whenever he had finished he didn't bother changing his clothes, you know, he just let the sun dry the clothes on him. But he went to the pictures in Derry that night. Like the smell was terrible. After about 5 minutes there nobody left in the picture house except himself.
The flax has now been spread out to dry, and with the weather still fairly good, in a few days' time it will be ready for gating. This involves loosening the beet around your leg to spread it out, and in this standing position with a drying wind it will be completely dry in a short time.
It's not easy getting it to stay now. You could lay better than that when you have a hair to it. Which way do it?
It was very wet when you came out of the dam.
You wasn't expecting it to be dry, were you?
We were.
Sandy now builds it into a stook. The flax is now much lighter and easier to handle than when it was last stooked in the field.
How long will it sit in the stook for, Sandy?
Oh, well, look, we usually let it sit in the stook for 3 or 4 days. But the right time of the year, I think that'll be long enough, Thompson. What you call a double stook, you see. You start here in the middle.
The final stage in the drying process was to build a shig.
Not much more.
Is that now, Sandy?
This marked the end of the farmer's part in the linen process. His job was now done, and the next stage was far removed from the tranquility of Gortnamoya farm life. The retted crop was drawn the 7 miles from Gortnamoya to Macna, and from the peace of the farm to the noise of the next stage of the linen industry, that of the scutcher. In the townland of Macna, near Upperlands, is still in operation the oldest Scotch mill in Ulster. For many generations, the Lagan family have operated the mill, powered by the Clady River, and it is their proud boast that their mill has scutched the first and the last dam-retted flax grown in Ulster. With 16 feet of a head, there is more than enough power for the water to drive not only the scutch mill, but also a 5-foot circular sawmill, and also provide electricity for the whole concern. It is here that Tom's flax is brought for scutching. Barney Lagan opens the sluices. The mill race which feeds the turbines begins to flow, and slowly the big flywheel begins to turn. The water passes through the turbines and runs back into the river via the tail race. Tales were told of how trout and salmon could be trapped in the tail race if things were managed correctly, but no one round here knew anything about that. In years gone by, the mill would have been in operation for most of the winter, scutching the huge quantities of flax produced in this one of the main flax growing areas of Ulster. Nowadays, however, it is in operation less frequently, but nevertheless Barney can still call upon the able assistance of his son Michael, Christy Mellon and Herman Glazer to man the mill when needed, usually assisted by the farmer who produced the flax and a few others. Today Sandy Gray takes over the traditional role of the farmer, namely the handfuller, in bringing the flax beets forward, spreading them out evenly, gathering them into handfuls and making them ready for the roller. On busy days he would have had someone tending him, bringing the beets forward and cutting the bands. Barney reckons that Tom's flax is in good shape despite the poor season and should scutch well. The handfuls of flax are fed into the set of rollers by Christy Mellon. In this case, a 16-power set of fluted barrel-type rollers made, like the turbines, by Kennedy's of Coleraine. The rollers crush the flax, fracturing its outer layers, and as it is drawn through, it passes through gradually narrowing grooves in the rollers to emerge on the other side. The job of the rollerman was an important one, for he controlled the rate at which the whole mill operated. The rolled and flattened handfuls of flax passed through the rollers into the hands of the strickers. This job was usually performed by women, and in a typical mill there would have been 2 or 3 of them. Their job was to prepare the flax handfuls for the scutchers, and this simply involved lifting the handful, twisting it once, twice, and setting it down for the scutchers. It looks simple, but it isn't. Barney gives a demonstration. The stricks of flax next passed to the scutchers. In the old days there would have been 6 or 8 of these whirling machines operating in a row, and this was by far the most dangerous part of the whole linen industry. The scutching machines were composed of a vertical stock, and rotating at 240 revs per minute a couple of inches away in the same plane was a scutching rim with a number of handles of beech or sycamore. In Barney's mill there are 5 beech handles to the rim, though some machines had 6 or 7. The handles were designed to flail the remains of the outer layer of the flax against the stock, shedding this, the shows, and leaving the clean white fibre. The stricks or handfuls from the strickers were passed on to a long bench, behind which the scutchers practiced their ancient art. The procedure varied slightly from mill to mill, but usually the first man, known as the buffer, lifted the strick and gave it its first rough run through the machine. It was then passed to the second scutcher, who took 2 buffed stricks and gave them a second finer scutching, known as cleaning or finishing. In each case the process was the same. The handful of flax was held in the middle, and the butts were scutched down one side, then turned and done down the other side. Finally the stricks of scutched flax or hanks were placed in a box above the scutcher's machine. These boxes were emptied regularly, usually at the end of a shift, and weighed, for unlike the other mill workers, the scutcher was paid by the weight of flax he scutched. It took roughly 13 scutched stricks or hanks of flax to make 1 stone in weight. In the 1950s, the scutchers were paid 2 shillings or 10p a stone. Given this productivity incentive, scutchers were actually very well paid for the times, as indeed were all who worked with flax. The strickers were paid £2 a week, and the roller man, who was a very important person, was paid £3 per week. Scutch mills were dangerous places. The combination of tinder-dry flax and shows and flying drive belts meant that most of them burnt down at some stage in their history. Bearing in mind the noise, heat and tremendous amounts of dust and the speed with which the scutchers were obliged to operate, it is little wonder that few of them escaped unscathed. The dust caused a lung disease known as flax byssinosis, and many were the injuries received, and there were few old scutchers who retired with a full complement of fingers. Old men tell of the noise from the machine when a finger or hand was struck. All around the mill you could hear the sudden change in the note of the machine from a whir to a whacking noise as a scutcher was injured. Christie has worked here for 40 years. His initials are on the wall to prove it. But he tells of a generation before that, when all the scutchers from this mill and many other mills went off to the Great War. Only 2 of them came home to Macna, and they never worked again. In 1940, for the huge investment of £600, Barney's father bought this Belgian scutching mill. Made by Robert Bobby and Sons of Bury St Edmunds, this machine was developed around the same time as the flax pulling machines. Like them, it did the work of many men, and it seemed as though the booming flax industry of Ulster was poised to take another huge surge forward. If proof were ever needed that it is impossible to foresee future events, it is surely the fact that within 15 years the flax industry of Ulster was almost non-existent. Herman feeds the conveyor belt of the new machine straight from the roller. The strickers are obsolete now, as are the scutchers, for the 4 drums of the long machine each scutch one of the 4 quarters of the flax bundles, in the same manner as the scutchers had been doing with their twisting wrist movements for 2 centuries. The 4 drums, each with 1 horizontal handle and counterbalancing weights, rotate at 580 revs per minute, to first buff and secondly clean both the butt ends and then the heads of the flax as it passes steadily down the machine. Here we see one of the drums rotating at 1/5 normal speed. At the far end it only remains for Barney to lift off the scutched flax, and after this hand dressing process, twist it into hanks. It is generally accepted that this Belgian machine not only does the work of many scutchers, but produces a better quality hank at the end. There are various ways of testing the quality of scutched flax. The strands should not break evenly but have split ends, and there should be a slight oily texture to it. Barney reckons that Tom's flax is as good as he has scutched in 40 years. The 1 stone bundles of scutched fibre have now made the long journey to Tandragee in County Armagh, where Thomas Sinton and Company have been spinning fine linen yarn since 1866. With 126 years of experience, the Gortnamoya flax should be in capable hands here. Today, Irish linen is used mostly in the famous fashion houses of the world, as well as traditional uses for household textiles and furnishing fabrics. Before spinning, the fibre will have to be hackled. Hackling was similar in many ways to scutching, only much finer. The process also separated the long fibre, called the line, from the short fibre, called the toe. It is fed into the machine in small pieces. Nowadays, Sintons import most of their flax fibre from Belgium. This comes already hackled. but production manager Mr. Brian Noble has willingly agreed to hackle and process this scutched fibre. The hackled fibre looks and feels good, similar in appearance to well-groomed blonde human hair. It is now transferred to the preparing room, where it is hand spread onto a spreadboard to form a continuous sliver, which makes further processing simpler. After spreading, the flax sliver is processed across a set of drawing frames. This is called a system. The system consists of 5 drawing frames, which progressively draw out the sliver and double it to produce an even sliver ready for roving. The roving frame produces rove by inserting a small amount of twist into the sliver as it is wound onto a centre called a rove bobbin. When the bobbins are filled with fibre, they are taken off by a team of girls called doffers. The short fibres, or tow, from the hackling follow a slightly different process route, during which they are cleaned and again formed onto a sliver, eventually being used in other materials including clothing. The material is now ready for wet spinning. In the spinning room, the rove is fed through a trough of hot water at 170 degrees Fahrenheit to soften the gums which hold the fibre bundles together, and then the rove is drafted out between sets of fluted rollers to give the final thickness or lee of linen yarn required. The yarn is wound onto aluminium bobbins, with twist again being inserted into it at the same time. When these bobbins are filled, the doffers take them off. They are replaced by empty bobbins, and the whole process starts again. After spinning, the yarn is dried in huge steam ovens at 170 degrees Fahrenheit. The yarn will stay in the oven for 8 hours. The final process at Sinton's is automatic winding, where the yarn is transferred from spinner's bobbins onto a package suitable for use in a weaving factory. These machines automatically join the yarn together to form a continuous length up to 40 miles long on each comb. After winding, the yarn is packed into dispatching boxes, ready to be transported to local weaving factories. Sinton's also export to Europe, the USA and the Far East. Clark's of Upperlands near Mahara was founded in 1736 by Jackson Clark, and from modest beginnings the Clark family have created an international business that supplies garment manufacture worldwide. Ironically, this next step in the production process is only a mile away from Barney Lagan's scutching mill and is also situated on the Clady River. By the 1740s, Jackson's reputation for excellence had spread to both local and overseas markets, and by this time orders were coming in from England, Europe and the plantations of the new American colonies. Many changes have taken place in the linen manufacturing industry since those days, and it is now in the hands of the 7th generation of Clarks. The combs of spun flax, which are brought in from Thomas Sinton's, now go through the weaving process. First, this modern sectional warping machine, controlled by computer, lines out the spun fibre ready for weaving. There are about 400 combs on this rack. By 1950, when this shuttle weaver was installed, Clarks were employing between 400 and 500 people. This shuttle terry towel weaver is using 50% flax fibre and 50% cotton. Everything is inspected and checked, for Clarks pay particular attention to quality. Some of this woven linen will go for dyeing, and some will go to the beetling room. The beetles are so called because of the way they tramp along the linen rolls and are made from beams of beechwood. The operation is controlled by this giant shaft driven by the Cloddy River. It lifts up the beetles, then lets them drop, battering the cloth until all the fibres are fused together. This also gives a shiny finish. The finished material, now very valuable, will go for making clothing. The noise in the beetling room is deafening, and ear protection has to be worn at all times. Robert Jones shows some of the beetled material which has been battered for a week or more. Back in the weaving shop, the rolls of woven linen will have to go through various processes depending on the end product required. We will stay with this one, which is going to make Irish linen tablecloths. The fabric has still a lot of work to be done with it. It is still quite coarse and not yet the right colour. Finishing, as its name suggests, is the final series of processes through which the fabric must pass before it is ready for the ultimate consumer. In the old days, the process of bleaching was carried out at bleaching greens, of which there were many around the country. This involved only water and sun, and indeed until the 18th century the use of any chemical agents was punishable by death. Over a 6 to 8 week period, the linen was subjected to a succession of boilings, followed by spreading out on the adjacent linen green to dry in the sun. Because of the very high value of the linen, it had to be guarded night and day by linen watchers, who spent the nights in appropriate accommodation. Nowadays, James Merland Limited near Castlewellan, County Down, specialise in dyeing, bleaching and finishing, and the rolls of brown fabric are put into this large pot where whitening or bleaching will take place. Boards are then placed over the cloth to keep it below the liquid. This bleaching cycle will last for 6 hours. The bleached cloth is then put through a washing machine where any surplus bleach or grime is washed away. The bleaching and washing operation create twists in the cloth, and the next process is oddly enough called scutching. The scutcher opens out the cloth, straightens it again, and the mangle also squeezes out any excess water, although it is still quite wet when it comes off at the other end. The drying range is next in line, but first it passes through this trough of liquid, which on this occasion is adding a bluing agent to give it the required finish. The cloth then passes over heated cylinders which dry it out completely, although a little moisture should be left for framing the cloth. On the calendar, which consists of heavy rollers, the cloth is flattened, which gives it a better light reflection known as lustre. This process is a substitute for the process of beetling, but never attained the high standard that is still achieved by the beetling mill. The cloth then passes over a plating device which piles it into a truck. Ulster weavers off the Donegal Road in Belfast now take the fabric, which before coming here has had a print or design added to it. This lady will sew it into a tablecloth. The tablecloth will then be pressed or ironed. The Gortnamoya flax has been handled 27 times since it was sowed on the 20th of May. No wonder Irish linen is so expensive. On the 27th of October, it was my pleasant duty to return to Gortnamoya with the end product of many months of hard work. The flax had made a full cycle, and Mrs. Mary Stewart is now the proud owner of this linen tablecloth, made from the flax grown by her son. That's part of it anyway.
Just come in then, we'll have a cup of tea.
Well, thanks very much indeed. That's the best place to put a tablecloth.